Yeah, that date is going to change.
Okay.
I have to stagger everything because I'm not as far along as I thought I would be. So I'll be sending you an email on that. Yeah, because it kind of hinged on whether I talked about the labels and text in class on Wednesday, but I thought with it being midterms week and so many people being stressed, I thought, yeah, yeah. So I wanted to make sure you had the lecture before you were doing the labels. So that'll all be staggered. In the beginning of the semester, I had mentioned how being a curator is not only in an historical context, but it is within a cultural context, a social context, a political context, and then an institutional context, in that as a curator, you're expected to work with other individuals, departments, or divisions, unless you are a one-man show, as it is in many tribal centers. So today's discussion is on the roles of a curator, in particular as you would interrelate those roles with someone who is working in conservation. Because the mandates of each position are somewhat similar and somewhat different, and those mandates also in some ways may go against what many tribes believe about the objects that they have. So we'll talk about what some of those differences are. So some of the dilemmas. I mean, how can you step into a new role? An indigenous curator. This is a relatively new being. As not only an indigenous curator, but a woman curator, for example. That how do you step into this new role with new ideas rather than maintain old, outdated paradigms? You remember, a paradigm is a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking that shapes our behavior. It's agreed upon ways that we think about information and even carry out research. And what has occurred, for example, as an indigenous curator, you may be coming from a society that was formerly collected, and you are now the collector. That you may be accessioning objects into the collection that you feel the institution needs, and where you were formerly someone who was collected. So, for example, baskets. All right, this looks like about 1920s, and where this would have previously been collected before your lifetime, and may be in your tribe's museum. Now you are the one doing the collecting. Right? And it may be a tribal museum, but you may be working, say, for the Denver Art Museum. You are working with a culture that was formerly being restored, cultural restoration, to being the one who's doing the restoring. So it's not a passive thing. You are the one who is participating in this. That the objects that you're working with, you were formerly someone as a culture who was conserved. And now you're turning into the conservator. That formerly your tribe was curated by others, and now you have become the curator. The tribal museum may have had a non-native director, and you're now the director. Or for that matter, someone who is formerly thought of as being uneducated to someone who's being educated. This is a real challenge, because in academe, one of the, you might say, badges you need to wear are the initials behind your name. And each of them affords you different privileges. So, for example, if you have MFA after your name, what does that mean? Masters of Fine Arts. All right, it doesn't mean mighty fine artist. And that is considered a terminal degree, an MFA. If you're going to teach art, it's considered that means the last degree you need. As compared to if you were going to be teaching art history, or you were going to be an administrator, many might expect those initials to be PhD, which many thinks means piled higher and deeper, but it actually means doctorate in philosophy. And one of the challenges in academe is that really what you're doing in your discipline, you are learning more and more about less and less. In your master's program, they may expect you to specialize in a given area, such as oil painting. And then if you go on to your PhD, they might want you to speak about, in particular, Florentine pre-Renaissance artists. So you're knowing more and more about less and less. You know, the scope becomes more narrow. This does not mean that you are more educated than anyone else. And this is a challenge in academia. It means that you've done a lot of book learning. That in many tribal centers, you have people who have as much knowledge that does not come from books, that's from life learning, that is as valid as the book learning. And this becomes a challenge. I noticed this as a, when I would apply for a job, I could say, hello, I'm Stephen Fadden. And I went to Santa Fe Community College. People just look at you, blank. But as soon as I said, hello, I'm Stephen Fadden, I've got a Master's of Science from Cornell University. It was like pulling out a Luke Skywalker lightsaber. My ex is a double doctor, a doctorate in environmental toxicology and veterinary medicine. When she was an undergraduate, she was every bit as smart. But it wasn't until she had those initials after her name that when she stood up to speak, people started to shake. Those initials meant something in academia. In a tribal center, they may not mean as much as we are conditioned by the institutions to believe they mean. It means that we have survived an academic program. But it may not mean that you are a good administrator. One of the jokes I remember at Cornell University, what do you call someone who graduates with a D grade in vet medicine? The same title you would use on someone who graduated with the A. So it's important to remember in institutions that degrees, you ever heard that expression, pedigree? That's usually what they give to dogs. All right, what brand are you? What breed are you? People look at academic institutions that way too. And that we are products of our institutions as much as we are products of our culture. And you might find, Tasha, when you go home and you start to use $35 words that you learned here at IAIA, and your family's going to look at you like you've been possessed and they need to exorcise you. They tell you you're sounding all highfalutin. Oh, you're smarter than us. No. You went to a school where you learned the words. And it's really important to keep this in mind as part of this dilemma that we have with education and life learning. That we'll find that in many tribal, particularly in your cultural centers where they are meant to maintain culture, the life learning and cultural knowledge is much more important than someone who learned more and more about less and less. And that, in many ways, goes counter to the academy, because the academy, in many ways, is a system that conditions people to think like that system. And so, as someone in a museum, as a conservator, or as a curator, sometimes these are the challenges you're going to face. And they are going to be academic as well as cultural challenges, based on how people read the initials after your name. We realize that as a curator, we are interdependent, which means that we rely on other people to perform our jobs. As a curator, if no one is producing work, if there are no objects out there, you don't have a job. So you can go into teaching instead. You're still a curator, because in a classroom, you are curating information. You are deciding, you are looking at a vast amount of information, you're deciding what is needed for any particular lecture or any particular course. You are arranging it, you are labeling it, But in this case, you're presenting it as if every class is an opening. You're still a curator. That's why it's important, if you go into a curatorial job, try to learn about educational theory. Try to learn about various ways that people learn. Because as you're presenting information to various individuals of various cultures, it's important to understand how people learn. So you are maintaining new ideas and works, possibly. You're creating platforms of ideas. You're creating venues, we'll say, for artists to present their work. You may be initiating and sustaining dialogues. You may be formulating opinions about what's out there. And this is if you're working with contemporary artists and critics. It's a whole different ballgame if you're working with objects, say, of cultural patrimony. If you're involved in NAGPRA kind of work as a curator. If you all had the repatriation class here, if you haven't, I strongly suggest taking it, because it really does give you a strong understanding of that NAGPRA itself was a good idea. It needs a lot of work. And a lot of that work comes from the viewpoints that many curators are putting out there, particularly from indigenous perspectives, because indigenous people view objects differently. So even when you're working with so-called historic objects, to many societies, they are still alive. They still have a story that is being told. And for that matter, people should still be able to touch them. That will drive a conservator crazy. And we'll talk about why. You also have this responsibility to continuously update your research. And we mentioned how earlier in the semester that we are making decisions about the type of information we are even going to put into our indexes, because some of it is so culturally sensitive that we don't want to find ourselves not being able to live in our own community. There were various Native American anthropologists who violated the trust of their tribal communities by publishing certain pieces of information, and for that matter, photographing certain objects in such a manner that they ceased to exist in their communities. Their name, they became what they call persona non grata. Because they violated acting as an individual, which should have been a group and a cultural decision. So when you're updating research, being aware as a curator that you have a responsibility, first to your tribe, if you're working for that tribe, not to academe. That goes counter to what you'll learn at George Washington University in their Museum Studies program. That's what makes this program here unique. In the States, you're addressing timely not only the artistic, social, cultural, political issues, but even historical issues. And your idea is to facilitate. Your mandate is to assist things rather than tell people how things are done. That's part of interdependency. And the roles have expanded because you may be commissioning temporary works, and that may relate to so-called ephemeral. Ephemeral means that it's here now and it's gone in 10 minutes, like a performance piece. Now, in essence, I'm ephemeral. I have turned an ephemeral lecture, in other words, if I wasn't using this recording machine, when I'm done, it's gone. Now, you all have a record of what was said. None of you are going to have a record that looks identical. You will all have different sets of notes. That's why it's a good idea, by the way, to share notes in a class, because someone may have missed something that you have, and vice versa. So tag team when you're taking notes. But ephemeral means it's there and then it's gone. And you may be commissioning a performance piece. If any of you have been seeing Chaz Jamison Banks on Facebook, I mean, this guy lives in his own world. He teaches printmaking here as an adjunct, but he's got a real thing for uniforms. Right? And he does performance pieces. And you've got to be there to see the performance. When the performance is done, if you weren't there, it's gone. All that's left is the photo and whatever people wrote down or if it was recorded. So you may be commissioning things that are temporary. The ephemerality may last a little bit longer. Nora Naranjo Morse did a piece for the Smithsonian that opened when I was speaking at the National Gallery of Art and the Smithsonian a few years ago. It was called Always Becoming. And it was an outdoor sculpture. And I went back a year later, and only half of it was there. Because it was meant to deteriorate. You are facilitating residencies, that you're editing books, catalogs, and digital media. You may be organizing one-time, short-term events. All of these, though, if they relate to physical, tangible objects, depend on a particular individual in a museum releasing those objects to you. If that position exists in the museum, you may have a you may be a curator / conservator. So it means that you cannot have a set mindset. You have to have an awareness of the big picture. And that is not only of the museum mandates, but the cultural mandates if you're working in these various centers that are portraying culture. That you've got to be able to think concretely. You've got to be able to speak very concretely. When you're writing labels for this class, they have to be very clear. And yet at the same time, they've got to be creative. You've got to make them interesting, and you have to have the ability to think in the abstract. You have to be able to think beyond the object itself and possibly think about meaning or allow yourself to see connections of images you may see in one basket, for example, as compared to something you would see in another kind of basket from another culture. You've got to be somewhat adventurous and dynamic. Adventurous means being able to take chances at the same time without offending people. Because you violate trust when you offend people. And when you're dynamic, it means that dynamic means constantly changing. So you got to have that ability to change your ideas and switch gears quickly. And you have to be able to articulate really complex ideas simply. And we'll see this when we are writing our museum labels after the break. I can't believe it's midterm already. So, you may be the conservator, or you may be working in an institution where the conservator is a formalized position. Now, the nature of conservation. Conservation means to preserve. This can go counter to the intent of many works that were created by various tribes. And something that may have been created as an object for ritual use in the 1890s may not have been meant to be preserved, to be viewed in the 20-teens. It may not even have been viewed as art by the individual or the culture from which that object originates. So, conservators are very, very, very object-oriented. Their whole focus is on preserving the physical, structural integrity of an object for future generations. In other words, it's almost like you are like a zombie master. You're trying to keep something alive beyond its natural lifespan. Because when we're working particularly with a lot of Native American art, we're working with a lot of organic materials. Organic materials deteriorate. As you can see on this basket, that already the salvage edge here has become damaged. That is not only from the aridity, because it is dried out, but from handling, even from light. or dust or heat, poor storage. And so if you get an object like this, as a curator, you've got to decide, do we have to spend too much to even maintain this? Is it already beyond what we get as a cultural educational value? Is it worth maintaining the life of this object? Is it worth our insurance? Is it worth storage space and conservation effort? Or do we let it die? So you are fixated on maintaining the structural integrity of an object as long as it exists. And you try to do so in a manner that they call non-destructive intervention. In other words, you are trying to maintain the object without destroying any part of it, which includes not introducing any type of chemicals that over time will cause something to deteriorate, placing something in storage areas where they will, you want to make sure they're not in storage areas where they won't deteriorate, so you've got to be very humidity oriented. And this is different from restoration, because in restoration, you are actually adding to something. So if I was to restore this basket, I would be finding bare grass, for example, and I would be creating the weft fiber first to build up the foundation of the basket, and then I would be interweaving the grass to create the, I did the warp for the foundation and then the weft for the pattern and the selvage. I'm adding material to it from modern time. And then I might even try to find a way to patinate it. Patina is the surface that something acquires either through handling or with age. So I might want to make it so this basket looks uniform in its color, in its look. Because if I were to add new grass fiber on here, it's going to look very, very bright compared to the older fiber. So I might actually be adding a little bit of dirt. I might even be one of the things that I part of this additive process is of patinating. There are sometimes the process of restoring may mean taking a part of the object and actually removing it in order to put it somewhere else. So, for example, if there was a figure, a wooden carving that originally was wearing a necklace in miniature with a naja on it, but it looks like a horseshoe. You see them on Navajo squash blossom necklaces. It's actually a Moorish design. It's an Islamic design that made its way to the Americas. But the naja is gone. You see all the other carved parts of the squash blossom, and that part's gone. Restoration might mean turning that object upside down where the feet are and cutting out a little piece of wood from that object in order to place it so that it would have the same surface, the same grain as the original would have had. So that's actually destructive to the object to maintain it. You're destroying one part to show another. But you're doing it in such a way that it's not physically obvious. So it's either destructive or non-destructive. When you are doing conservation, anything that you're doing also has to be reversible. And that means that you have to document everything you do in restoration. You also have to have summary reports. So if I was, as a conservator and a restorer, to work on this basket, I would have photographs of it showing its original state. I would also have photographs of the media that I would be introducing to restore it. And then I would have photographs of the process, photographs of the finished product, so that it's documented, and then I should be able to undo all of that. You also are going to be assessing the propriety of releasing something because the curator has come to you and they want to have an exhibit on baskets. And they want to include this particular basket. And you're looking at it and you're saying, this thing's damaged. And if it's put in this exhibit, it's going to be damaged even more. Not a good idea. So no, you cannot use this basket. Albeit, so what? Yes, it's got a beautiful 6-point star medallion in the middle. Too bad. Find another one or do an intermuseum loan. This one does not have the structural strength to stand up to being exhibited. This is why it's important to work hand in hand with a conservator so that you learn the structural integrity of all the objects you may want to access as you are planning exhibits. Because these are going to be decisions also in the acquisition or deaccessioning of objects. So you may be involved in this process as a curator. If you're in a multi-department museum, much of this would fall into the responsibility of the conservator, which means that any time that you want to plan an exhibit using that museum's collections, you have to get the release from the conservator. If you are doing an intermuseum loan, you're going to have to get the release from that museum's conservator. In other words, their consent that an object will survive structurally intact to be maintained beyond its natural lifetime. Now, as a conservator, there are specific qualifications. Generally, they expect graduate level training in a recognized conservation program, museum conservation program, which includes 2 years or more in the theories of conservation, principles and practices in conservation, and at least 1 year in general material conservation, which means 1 year where you have actually taken the theory and the principles and you are working on them in real life on an array of different objects, which would include paintings, sculpture in stone, sculpture in wood, prints, textiles. And that's meant so that when they turn you out into the field, you have a generalized education that you could work with many of the types of objects or materials that are found in various museum collections. If you have a particular interest in textiles and the museum you're applying for has a strong focus in textiles, such as up at Fort Lewis, they may want that you have had an internship working in a museum that has a solid textile collection. There are heavy-duty science expectations, which include chemistry, biochemistry, and biology. So if you want to be a conservator, you are going to be amped up on the sciences. Very often, too, it's expected that you would have at least 2 years of postgraduate experience beyond college under the guidance of a professional. So you might say that you have become, where you have a mentor and you are the student of this mentor. They have taken you into this apprenticeship type of relationship. So it's not only the academic and then the hands-on, but it's hands-on under the guidance of people who are already known in the field. That the abilities you need to be able to demonstrate are not only the manual skill in treatment of materials. You have to know the knowledge of the various technologies and materials of the artistic, historic, scientific, and technological objects. You actually have to know a lot about the objects with which you are working, as well as the chemical, physical processes of deterioration. How to be able to spot deterioration and know what the culprit might be. This means that you may also have to be present in the same way that a coroner is expected to fill out a report of cause of death. They have to be present, all right, in the morgue. A conservator has to be present at the acquisition of an object with an awareness of the various types of deterioration that could occur. Why do you think that would be? What might be the kinds of things you would have to look out for? Okay, something that the museum wants to acquire may actually be destroyed in transit. It may be actually so fragile that it wouldn't survive the trip. That may mean actually not being present on your location, but in the institution, individual, or organization that, say, wants to donate it to you. Yes, you want to make sure, and this is why the condition reports are so important. You want to make sure that an object is received in the same condition that it left the original institution. So you're looking at, once again, for damage. There are other types of things, though. For example, you've got a wooden carving that comes into the museum, and you'll note that the carving, as it's in its box, has a little bit of sawdust next to it. What should that alert you to? It may have been altered. Okay, so it could have been actually, the integrity could have been challenged or compromised by an individual. What else? Could be an imitation. It could be a fake. Or if there's a little sawdust underneath the sculpture, starts with a T. Termites. You could actually have bug infestation. And it only takes one. It only takes one moth egg to destroy a textile collection. Now, I was lucky. No museum, even in 50 years, this is a really classic Pendleton jacket. And the pattern is based on a pattern that was done by a famous Navajo weaver by the name of Bessie Manygoes. There's something on here that would make any museum conservator say, nope, 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 nope. Moth. Moth damage. Which means that there were probably eggs in it. What I did when I got this coat, because I got it at Goodwill for $4.99 with the tags on it. It hadn't even been worn. $4.99 for a $299 coat. Oh yeah, man. I'm big into recycling clothes. But I knew what to do. I immediately put that coat in a garbage bag, and I put it into a freezer. And I left it in the freezer for a week. I took it out, left it in the bag, tightly sealed, and I put it in a window where there was sunlight coming in the window that caused the bag to heat. Any eggs in there would have perceived that warmth as time to hatch. So I left it in the sunlight for 3 days, and then I took that bag and I put it back in the freezer to kill anything, any of the eggs that hatched. And I repeated that process several times. Yes. Never, and this is also when we're talking about toxic properties of materials. Never, 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 never use mothballs. Naphthalene. They rot your body, and they're not good long-term for structural integrity of textiles. One of the best ways to preserve textiles in museums, cedar chips. It has a strong aroma. It smells wonderful, so any clothing you take out smells beautiful, but it wards away insects. So insect damage, possible forgeries or fakes, possible damage, these are all things to be aware of as a conservator. As a conservator, also knowing the various techniques to interrupt or to actually, not just interrupt, but stop any type of deterioration before something has gone too far. So it would still fit the needs of a museum. and would need a minimum. This is a minimum of maintenance or restoration. So this is why it's important to know not only the chemical, physical processes of deterioration, such as recognizing even the little angel dust that will appear on something. The little, not angel dust, but it'll look like little spider webs or something, usually you have insect infestation. Little sawdusts, or you see little holes in a frame from worms. Being aware of all of that, insect as well as chemical. You might try mineral water, which is about the best you could do. Because if it's already started to deteriorate like that, yeah, and so you would use a, like a regular paintbrush, half-inch paintbrush, and actually just brush the mineral water on there. Because you're not putting out for an exhibit, you just want to maintain it. And it will it'll re-humidify. Or I'm sorry, God, did I say mineral water? Yeah, mineral water is if you're trying to get stains out of a textile. Mineral oil, yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So, and sometimes, for example, if something is spilled on a textile, if you get mineral water or that bubbly water, you can actually, if you pour it on it right away, it will lift the pigment up and you're able to save the color underneath. These are all things that you learn along the way. You need to know the procedures that relate to examining as well as preventing and, for that matter, corrective treatment of objects. So as I mentioned about being able to spot some of the early warning signs, damage signs, deterioration, structural integrity, how, if something is already in a good state, to maintain it that way. So knowing the properties of, and that includes even various types of wood require various types of humidity. Or corrective treatment. And knowing not to use mothballs, for example. You also need to be able to have, you have to be able to write detailed, thorough reports. As a conservator, and for that matter, as a curator, you may be writing reports about every object in the museum. And this is what drove many curators crazy when NAGPRA was passed. Because if your museum was federally funded, you had to do an inventory of every one of your objects to see if it matched the criteria that meant that it would be repatriated. It made many curators and conservators crazy because they had to write detailed reports about every one of those objects, including the procedures of acquisition. You also want to make sure, along with this writing detailed reports, that sometimes you might get something that looks like it's really dirty. You may have the responsibility to leave it really dirty. Not only because you may damage the object by removing the dirt itself might actually have been part of the process. But you want knowledge of environmental requirements and controls for handling, which includes humidity, requirements for storage, exhibition, transportation of objects, and various specimens. Specimens tends to relate to organic things. So stuffed badgers. Pickled fish and the like. You also have to be able to communicate. To other staff, so that if they are participating in approved conservation practices, that they are doing so correctly. You have to be aware of the latest relevant literature for the various technologies. You may be, if you are the first conservator of a museum, have to actually start the conservation laboratory from scratch. And very important, aware of environmental risks from various technologies and practices. Not only risks to the objects, but risks to human beings. There were some, they call them false face carvings, for example, that were collected by museums in New York State. They're medicine masks that probably should not have been, no, not probably, should not have been in the museum collection anyway. They're healing masks. And they were preserved with arsenic. They look really great today, but you sure wouldn't want to touch one. It was considered standard conservation practice in the 19-teens, is now seen as being very, very hazardous. The object states the actual condition when something enters the collection. This is why digital photo documentation, as well as the written documentation, is required. And this is considered a static benchmark. A benchmark means something by which everything else is measured. And in this case, the benchmark, if you have this object as it looked in 2013, and then you're doing a conservator's report at 2018, every 5 years, you're going to be looking at the original object report to see how much that object has changed. Has there been any fading, for example? Is there any type of damage? Is there oxidation on metal parts? So that initial report is really critical. As well as the condition of the object as it's in the collection. A dynamic equilibrium, meaning you are trying to maintain it as best you can to the static benchmark in constantly changing situations. Because even there are, for example, have you ever heard of the cave paintings at Lascaux? They are giant murals on cave walls from just after Neanderthal period. Giant cave paintings of animals. They were discovered and became very popular. A huge tourist site. You cannot get in to see them now. And no one could actually touch them. They were high up enough on the walls that you couldn't touch them. What do you think happened to those to those paintings? What's that? They were affected by humans. Our breath. Doesn't mean people had bad breath. All right, but you get several 100,000 people in a cave in a year. That's a lot of carbon dioxide that was interacting with the pigments. And it was causing the paint to deteriorate. Yeah, it is. It's moisture. Yeah, our breath. So humans may not even have a direct hands-on connection to something, and something may deteriorate when you have a large number of humans in a space. So the key collaborative questions with curators, conservators, and if you're working with living artists, or possibly art from other time periods. What was the artist's intent on the preservation of that object? If you have the ability, you can interact with the person or persons themselves, but you may have to refer to the historical record. And I want to refer to this once again. There are many objects that were created for ritual use and were meant to have a lifespan just as human beings. And when they deteriorated beyond the point of being able to be using them, they were supposed to die. And then museum collectors may have come along and grabbed them, or they may have been bought from individuals. And so they were actually maintained beyond the intent either of the original artist or the original culture of origin. They may not have been intended for public display, like the false faces that I was talking about. Yeah, it may not even be meant to be photographed. Yeah. So, and that was also something that was, for example, with the false face masks. They said you shouldn't even have photographs of them. You know, they're actually living spirits. You know, and doing that was a decision's insensitive, a museum's insensitive decision, for example. So even can you photograph something? Or for that matter, when we're looking at ephemerality, there's a museum, it's the Wheelwright Museum. And the museum has collections of sand paintings and textiles that were done by Hosteen Claw, a very famous weaver in the 1930s and 40s. And he was a hatali, which means that he was a singer, one of the Blessing Way and other Night Way chant singers. And when you when you do a sand painting, at the end of that ceremony, it's supposed to be obliterated, the same way Tibetan mandalas are supposed to be obliterated after the ceremony. But he put them in permanent form. As an individual, he violated Navajo cultural protocol. He also recorded some of the various night chants on wax cylinders. Songs that were not supposed to be re-recorded, he sang. And in his day was chastised for doing so, for making a decision of being so self-important. His rationale was that we are forgetting our songs and our ceremonies, and someday people are going to need this. You know what? There are singers who have gone back and have learned old songs by listening to Hastin Kla. So, yeah, it's yeah. How do you preserve it? Yeah. So, I mean, that's part of that ethical dilemma. You also see that in the way that we curate language. There are many school systems that native school systems that do not want their tribal tongue spoken in the school, taught in school. For example, the various pueblos do not want Keres, Tewa, Towa taught in school, nor should it be written down. That's a challenge when your language is vanishing then, because a lot of parents in the home aren't speaking it. There are some people who would say, I see you smiling because I know it's a hot issue. Yeah, at Zuni, yeah. Yeah, yours is often pointed as one of the ones that say, see, the Zunis are doing it. Yeah, the reason I'm aware of that is because Hayes Lewis used to be my Goomba here. All right, that's one of the things that was amplified upon is language. All right, but you find among many of the pueblos, it's hands off. Now, where I'm from, there was a school that was started based on the language and a prayer. And so you learned your education by learning this prayer. However, some schools will say you can teach the language to speak it, but you can't teach them to write it. So, because there are various systems of writing. So Mohawk, actually, there was a guy who developed a syllabic system where you could speak Mohawk and not know a thing. But if you knew what each of those characters sounded like, you could speak Mohawk and have no idea what you were saying. They call it a syllabic system. These are the types of ethical dilemmas. And it also relates to art. Is something being used or photographed or recorded that should not be? Or was it created with the intent to be continuously used by a community, and now it's in a museum collection, and the community wants to use the object, and the conservator is saying, no, if you touch it, it's going to be destroyed. And you have the community saying, well, no, we'll just make another one. And the conservator saying, no, this is the benchmark. That becomes some of that challenge between academe knowledge and cultural knowledge. Academic maintenance and cultural maintenance. You have to maintain a database. You want to have a steadily maintained and updated record of the objects. Every one of them having the benchmarks and the various periodic reports. Most museums now have digitized records who are accessible to everyone. So if you go to the American Museum of Natural History, which has a massive collection of Indian objects, you could ask for permission to look at their conservation reports. And often the conservation reports will actually be part of the image that you are looking at. And also then as a conservator assisting curators in a decision-making process, as well as what type of resources within the museum have to be allocated in order for that object to be presented. And that resource allocation includes not only finance, but what type of lighting, what type of humidity, what type of access, and proximity of access. So if you can think of yourself as a team with the conservator, that a curator may be selecting the object or objects to fulfill the goals of the museum's collection mandates or exhibition mandates. The conservators are looking at the very same objects then, and they are evaluating the risk and the responsibility in acquiring those objects or displaying them for exhibition. And then you may be co-authoring an acquisition or exhibition brief that's submitted to the museum board. Because if it's an acquisition, the board has to, in essence, give the okay that that object can be acquired, because it means allocating resources to maintain the integrity of that object. If it's for an exhibition, the board has to release the finances in order to be able to put that exhibition on, which includes photography costs, for example, if you're doing a catalog. So you're looking at the current condition and concerns about the condition, what potential maintenance requirements and costs would be involved, which would include the treatment of the objects, the insurance of the objects, shipping, storage, and display. These decisions are best made by teams. The more people you can bring that have a common idea of what conservation and curation are, that you can bring together, the better decisions, the better quality of decisions you can make. Because you're going to be looking at the work in an entirely different eye than someone who is just strictly a museum educator, or someone who is just strictly the registrar. And then there is that nightmare then of ephemeral art, because these are works that are intended to have a short lifespan. Means they are going to deteriorate rapidly, and you have installation contexts to consider. Outdoor, indoor, well lit or not, high traffic or low traffic. And that includes performance pieces. It may include various types of installation where human interaction is supposed to occur, such as with Nora Naranjo Morse's Always Becoming. So that's part of the lifespan and the deterioration. So the decay is actually part of the object's intent and meaning. It's going to be difficult sometimes with works like this to justify the cost to the board. So if you are working with ephemeral works, you really have to be able to address how whatever it is you are presenting relates to current trends in art or culture history, as well as artists. This is why it's important to have an awareness of the big picture. So ephemeral is you might say, a nightmare that both the curators and conservators have, because the objects or the exhibitions, the performances are meant to be here today and maybe gone in an hour or gone next week. Challenges you may encounter in installation is that when non-institution works are entering for temporary loan and possibly permanent acquisition, you need the condition report, photographs. These all serve as that benchmark. You need to be able to communicate with the couriers being the individuals or companies who are actually transporting the work, about the transit process. You need to have mutually agreeable levels of protection, which includes not only insurance, but the technologies that are used to protect objects in transit. And, as Therese had mentioned, you have to be physically present when something arrives to be able to verify or reconcile the state of the work as it comes in. So you get the report from the courier of that object, you read it, you look at the photographs, you read the condition reports, you then look at the object itself, and you see, is it a match or not? If there was damage, somebody's liable. If you sign it, if you sign off on that, you have immediately accepted liability. That's why these types of reports and being able to reconcile this are so important. If you've ever rented a car, you always want to do a walk around with the car rental agent and look for any dings, cracked windshield, any paint pock marks, anything. And you want to make sure you note those to that rental agent. Because if you do not, you may be liable to pay for that damage on that car. So that database is a dynamic in that you are updating it regularly, and it's a good idea. Some museums will have a 2-year policy where objects are inventoried every 2 years. Some may do it every 5 years. Others may do it actually based on the actual media that's being used in the object. Okay, the resource allocation, that is whether that includes things like finance, the money that's going to be spent to acquire or ship and then exhibit. It may also relate to wall space, lighting, special handling or exhibit precautions or instructions. Both the curator and the conservator are assessing the institutional conditions, which include the actual physical space, the lighting, traffic through a museum, and proximity to causeways. Because wherever there are causeways, there are going to be a lot of individuals. Individuals are breathing, and their breath may actually affect the structural and quality of various kinds of objects. You also may be developing behavioral cues that are beyond do not touch or you will be arrested. A behavioral cue, as I mentioned earlier in the semester, is a stanchion, which is 2 posts with a velvet rope hanging in between it, and it's in front of an object. It means that you are not supposed to go any closer than that rope. Or you may see a row of stanchions with velvet ropes on both sides, meaning that you are supposed to follow that row in between those ropes as you walk through the exhibit. You may see arrows on the floor. So other types of behavioral cues too. Or they may actually be mnemonic devices, pictures. So if you see a camera in a circle with a slash through it, what does it mean? No photography. What if you see a Coca-Cola can with a circle and a slash through it? Are they saying no Coca-Cola? Pepsi's okay? No, no beverages, or maybe no food. All right, these are other types of behavioral cues. Other challenges might be the various barriers, cases, that are going to be this intermediary between someone being able to access and interact with the various objects. Rule of thumb, the more people interact with something, the more something is going to deteriorate, unless you have any of these types of barriers, such as cases that are humidity controlled or light controlled. picture frames that are UV light controlled. But increased interaction means increased deterioration. That's not just handling, but actually humans being physically present, doing the things that humans do. I was at the National Gallery of Art, standing in front of a Jackson Pollock painting, and I watched the guy, we were both looking at it, and he sneezed, and a big loogie came out, and it hit the painting. Pollock probably would have loved it. It actually fit right in with the painting, all right? You wouldn't have known. But it's biological human matter. And it has enzymes in it that break things down. No. But after he was gone, I did. Yeah, I just went over because none of the museum staff was there other than the guards. And the guard actually was looking in a different direction. And so I just went over the guard and I said, you might want to alert the conservator because someone just sneezed on your Pollock.